David Marr is the award-winning author of Patrick White, A Life and the High Price of Heaven, and co-author with Marion Wilkinson of Dark Victory. He's written for the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, and The Monthly. I'm running through it all. Come on. When else are you going to get to brag like this? Reporter for Four Corners. Yes. Bear with me. It's a long CV. Presenter of Media Watch. You now write for Guardian Australia. And Bill Shorten, Faction Man, is his 5th quarterly essay. Please join me in welcoming David.
Thank you.
Okay, now, the morning after the spill, and to think it was only last week,
Yeah.
the Canberra Times' cartoonist David Pope tweeted, "Yeah, slept like a baby. And you, Bill?" And then it cut to his drawing of Bill Shorten, who was sitting bolt upright in bed and hadn't slept a wink. Can you guess at what was running through Bill Shorten's head the night of the spill?
Let's go back to the afternoon of the spill,
Okay.
because I want to paint the picture for you. This was my week off. These were the precious few days I had between the unending demands of black ink in terms of finishing the text and the unending demands of black ink in terms of promoting the text. I had this little window of 4 days. So my partner and I decided that we would drive from Sydney up to the New England to stay for a few days with my sister in Armidale, New South Wales. Okay. And we're driving up from the Manning Valley through the wild country at the back of the Manning Valley. And Sebastian says, let's put on the radio. And there's Malcolm Turnbull saying that he intends to claw down the Prime Minister. It's rivetingly exciting. But in the wild country at the back of the Manning Valley, there's not a lot of radio reception. So we were going in and out of range. And, I'd get a few fragments and anyway... So I said to Sebastian, put your foot down, we've got to get into range. And by the time we were in range, the phone's going and someone in Queensland wants an interview and I haven't even heard. But anyway, so that afternoon, I think, even before he managed to go to bed, Shorten would have understood that he had a totally new piece of combat on his hands, that he had a totally new opponent. The notion that they have never thought what they would do if Malcolm Turnbull became Prime Minister is rubbish. I mean, the Labor Party is not amateur. And one of the things that I'm trying to do in this essay is, apart from trace the hidden life of this rather mysterious leader, is to explain to the rest of Australia what politics is like in Victoria. Because it's not like anywhere else in Australia.
You needed a flow chart.
My editors who are here said of one of the chapter where I go really into the history of the factions, he liked it. He said it reads like a wildlife documentary. But the thing is, what fascinates me about all of that is, on the one hand, it is unbelievably appalling. But on the other hand, it trains a remarkably professional party. I mean, if you fought your way through the faction system to get a seat, even in the upper house, I'd withdraw that. To get a seat in Canberra, because the upper house in Melbourne, of course, is the consolation prize for factional hacks, for the most part. They're really professional, and I was alerted to this by one of the people that I was talking to, and he said, "Look, these people know what they're doing. They've survived the faction system. They've worked through the faction system. And the notion that the Labor Party was somehow ambushed by Malcolm Turnbull becoming leader is just rubbish. But for Shorten, it is an enormous challenge, not least for this. Australia wasn't fond of Tony Abbott and isn't fond particularly of Bill Shorten. But Australia loves Malcolm. And there's a political player on the scene now, Prime Minister in fact, who is liked. And that changes the dynamics of the competition, just that Malcolm is liked. Of course, the old Malcolm may well come back. And the old Malcolm is not so necessarily likeable, but we'll see. And Shorten has this completely different opponent. But my argument is that you look at his life, you look at his career, and you have to acknowledge that he is still a contender.
Well, let's do that. Let's look at his life. Let's look at his career, because of course you started researching this essay well before the spill, and
Sophie, I started researching this essay at a point where what worried the publishers most was that Tony Abbott was on a roll and might call a double dissolution election.
Wow, that seems like a century ago now.
No, that was May, June.
Yeah.
That was May, June of this year.
Well, and you start at the beginning with Shorten. You start at his suburban upbringing in Murrumbina, I think it was. How compelling was Shorten as a subject to start to sift through all the elements of his life in comparison to someone, say, like Abbott or Howard?
Well, you don't have the madness of Abbott, and let's face it. A man who, is recruited by Santa Maria, goes into the priesthood, gives up on the priesthood, goes into politics, brawls his way up through the Liberal Party, knocks off Malcolm Turnbull, and is remarkably, even though nobody in the country seems to like him, heading for a great victory. That is of itself so bizarre and seems now so unlikely that it has a flavour of its own. Now, with Shorten, it's a difficult life to track because so much of it is out of sight. And his career, his extraordinary career, has been lived and worked out of sight. Even though it's part of the day-to-day political discussion, conservatives say, trade unions are appalling, they're all grubby, they're all corrupt, and they're old-fashioned. You can't possibly have somebody who's a trade union leader imagining they could ever be Prime Minister. So all of that complaint. But we very rarely actually track people's careers through the union movement. And that's what I decided to do. I decided to seriously deal with this career in its own terms, through the union movement, through the factions, and into Parliament. And that was tough. There's a lot been written about it, but not in narrative form and not kind of all put together. I think this is the first time all of that has been put together in a coherent, in fact, I hope a dazzling form. But then there's the problems of his character, because being masked, turning to the world the face of a good and almost kindly man seems crucial to his way of presenting himself and the way of thinking about himself. He's in fact an incredibly ruthless, clever politician. And getting behind that mask I found difficult, but I think I got there.
There is that contrast between faction man and it's a very, very, very cutthroat world, and there are long-standing rivalries and hatreds and grievances.
But they can turn into love affairs. I mean, there's no reason why last week's rivalry can't be tomorrow's absolutely passionate attachment for a few weeks, or even perhaps a few years, and then they become bitter rivalries again. Now, I remember asking Greg Combay, how do these people live with themselves? And he said, there's no time for broken hearts, David.
But unlike a lot of former union leaders who go on to become politicians, Shorten is still deeply embedded in this stuff, isn't he?
Yes, he is. And that is a criticism that's levelled against him within the party by his old mentors, men like Bill Kelty, because he's still right down in there. Now, Shorten himself says that this gives him as a leader a better sense of what the party is actually thinking and doing than any leader before him. That this, he still goes right down the line when he wants things done, when he wants to know what's happening. He goes right down the line, and he approves of this as a strategy. Gives him knowledge of the party, it gives him great control of the party. But he's not like someone like Bob Hawke, who never really got involved in the factions in his entire career. He had other rather brutal people to do it for him, but he rode above that stuff. Shorten does not ride above it, but he's incredibly good at it. So he is not as much a prisoner of it as you might imagine, because he is good at it. He plays the factions.
How will that play out should he become Prime Minister?
The whole question, and this is one of the big questions that I explore in the essay, is, what does it mean in this day and age to have somebody whose career was fashioned inside the union movement leading the country? What would it be like? What does it do to the man? Well, what it does for Shorten is that he is a settler. He is a dispute by dispute man. He's not above, and when he was at the AWU, he was very keen about stacking on disputes. He's quietly proud. He's quietly proud of the fact that when he took over the AWU, it was a wreck at the time, when he took it over in the 1990s, he made it a much more militant union. But the thing is that he used to win the disputes and settle the disputes. Now, he's a settler. The thing is, you have a dispute, you have an argument, you come together, you settle, you move on. That's the pattern of his career. And it's the way he thinks about his public role. And that's a rather unusual pattern for a politician, where, dispute and settlement and negotiation are all part of the political world. But most politicians ultimately are about persuasion, about persuading the wider public to see their point of view. First persuading the party, then the wider public to see their point of view, to go with them on policy. Now, Shorten has lots of policy, etc., but that's not actually been the way he's got where he's got. He's got to the top by dispute, by settlement, by arrangement, by faction play, and all of it out of sight. And I say in the essay that what he's facing now, which is a general election, he's never faced anything like this in his life. This is an open contest where the factions aren't going to count, where he has to actually persuade most Australians to vote for him. And that's new. Everything else he's so skilled at, so practiced at, so clever and determined. What he's engaged in at the moment is completely new.
Well, let's come back to this mask that you talk about, his need to be the good boy. Where does that come from? What is that compulsion?
Well, we've got to be terribly careful not to go into what I call in the essay magazine Freud.
Go there, come on.
His mother is the key to his development. His mother was a phenomenon. His mother came from a poor family in Ballarat, and as I say in the essay, she had two faiths, Catholicism and education. She was the first member of her family, of her extended families, who ever went near a university, and she was brilliant. And she ended up with a PhD. She was lecturing in education at Monash University. She took a law degree just as something to do with a time when her children were teenagers, when her boys were teenagers, and she got the main prize for the law degree and all that. She was a phenomenon. She was a determined woman who believed in merit. She believed in education. She believed in achievement, etc., etc. She was a phenomenon. Dad, on the other hand, ran a dry dock on the Yarra, dealing on a day-to-day basis. He was the boss, but he was dealing on a day-to-day basis with the painters and dockers, and that was his life. And it was a very different man, very different life. And he drifted out of the family's life when the boys were teenagers. This mother and the kids, this determined mother put the kids into Xavier. This mother was about conquering worlds from which her family was excluded, by entering and conquering. And I feel with Shorten, and this is a long bow, and I don't produce evidence for this, it's just an intuition, a feeling of after all of this work and thinking about him and talking to him and being with him and reading about him, I think he feels slightly diffident about the world that he's entering, the world that he wants to conquer. He doesn't stride into it. He doesn't stride in and demand attention. He doesn't demand to be listened to, demand to be paid heed to. He's polite. In public, he's startlingly polite, agreeable, and you saw it on Q&A on Monday night. There's this sense in which he's being, I would just want him to sit up a bit more and be more demanding, tougher. As I say, I think people would respect him a little more if he let them see what a tough and capable operator he actually is, instead of this nice Bill, making notes on bits of paper and saying, well, 2 points there. Where's the mongrel? Because the mongrel is there, but he doesn't want us to see it. And I think that is the basis, even more deeply than questions about what policies does he stand for. I think that's the basis of the sense we have that he's such a fuzzy figure, because he's being polite to the world.
You talk about the fact that at one point you watch him talking in Union Man mode, and he's
electrifying.
He's very, very good at it.
Oh, it's fantastic.
So
a Shorten stump speech is fantastic. He just goes for it. There's no hesitation, there's no politeness. It's passionate, completely convinced. It's quite funny, and he just goes for it. And I asked him, why don't you talk like that? Beyond, we talk quite a bit in the essay about how he presents, and Sean McAuliffe was good enough to give me a number of insights into the difficulties of Bill's speech patterns. But he's very conscious of what he sees as the need to take the rabble-rouser out of him in order to be the leader of the opposition. Whereas my argument would be, give us the rabble-rouser. But he doesn't believe you can do that. He's politing it.
And he's still resistant to that idea, even given the zinger, even given the nicknames that have dogged him, which I'm going to read out. Actually, I just want to talk about nicknames for just one moment, because
there's a whole section
you list
in the essay
them in the essay, and I'm just one moment, okay? Bill career move Shorten. I finally won something Shorten. Golden Boy, King Billy, Showbag Shorten, Little Billy Shorten, Bill the Knife, Electricity Bill, the Prince of Darkness, Bullshitten, Mr. Potato Head, Adora Bill, or some of First Dog's over 80 different nicknames.
Did he provide 80 to you today?
I texted First Dog on the Moon, the Guardian cartoonist, on the way here and asked him for some of his nicknames, and I think he gave me at least 40, including Stiff Breezington, Buzz Flirting, and Babs Stilton. What is it about a man that attracts that many nicknames? Some of them are affectionate, some are not so much. What does that say about this man?
Number one, he has Bill as a Christian name.
Okay.
Number two, he has a surname which is punnable. And if you, as I, have lived with a punnable surname, by the time you're 15, you have already heard every joke anybody can ever make about your name, and yet people continue to produce jokes which they think are blindingly original, and you heard them when you were 11. So he's got that.
Okay.
But it's also, I think, this slightly prissy dignity that he has, which inspires people to ridicule him with names like, Adora Bill. Now, Adora Bill is said to have been the name that his staff used to give him when he was a junior minister under Rudd. And I'm not sure that it was necessarily affectionate.
Right. Okay.
I can't quite tell, but but he just attracts nicknames. And it was Tony Abbott who called him Electricity Bill, and I think that is a brilliant, brilliant nickname. Say what you like about Tony Abbott. He could come up with a good nickname.
But there's obviously a self-awareness there. If he's deliberately extracted the mongrel out of the image that he wants to project, does he have a sense of humour about himself?
Oh yes, he is quite funny about himself, and he's got a good sense of humour, which you don't see much in public. And he's quick. we would drive. I was in the back seat with him driving around somewhere one day, and just out of the blue, I said to him, "Were you first out?" And he roared with laughter. He knew immediately what I meant because he's one of twins, his father was William Robert Shorten, and Bill's brother is Robert. So I put my thinking cap on, and he laughed and he said, "Yes, I was." I mean, look, he's quick and he's funny like that. He's congenial, obviously. I mean, all politicians are congenial company. Some are more congenial than others. Kevin Rudd could be a mixed bag in that area. And he's quite funny about himself. Oh, yes. But not deeply funny, not...
And look, I want to stay on this charisma thing and this idea that he can be electrifying. Australia fell in love with Beaconsfield Bill.
Yes.
As soon as he became opposition leader, something happened. The way something happened to Julia Gillard. What is it? Do they give them a lobotomy? Why do they remove that charisma element?
And let's wait and see what happens to Malcolm Turnbull over the next few months. Look, I think the press has got a lot to blame for this. The message. The message must never... You must be on message and perfectly on message all the time. If you change one word, you can't say we've slowed down the boats. The boats have got to be stopped. You can't even say we've arrested the boats, because that would be a subject for discussion on Sky. There would be a Bolt column on it. I would probably write something about it. A word has changed, and therefore the stiffness of political discourse in Australia is to do with media managers and the press. And the toxic demands that there be nothing new unless it means something significant. I mean, it was also true of Gillard. Gillard, as anybody who's met Gillard in private for 5 minutes knows, that she's a scintillating woman, and yet out she would come in public and be cardboard. I was on the bus, on the election bus in 2010, the morning that it would be announced that the real Gillard would appear. And what they were talking about was getting her to show that scintillating side of herself in public, and she just couldn't do it. We went around that day and she was more wooden than ever. For Shorten, it's also the fact that becoming leader of the opposition was a considerable upscaling on any role that he'd had in the party before. It's very interesting to talk to members of the caucus from 2007 onwards and members of the cabinet from the time that Shorten joined the cabinet. And he didn't sit at the cabinet table until late 2011. So we're only talking 3 or 4 years ago. And they all say he concentrated on the tasks he'd been given, and he was fantastic on disabilities, is very good on superannuation, made real advances there, did them extremely well, but played surprisingly little role in the bigger life of caucus, or the bigger life of the cabinet, or the bigger life of the party. That his real political world continued to be the factions of Melbourne. The task at hand, the factions at Melbourne. Then he becomes leader of the opposition, and he has to learn. He has to learn what happens. And of course, even as he was battling it out with Anthony Albanese about who would actually lead the Labor Party, the allegations about him raping that woman went up on Larry Pickering's website. And that knocked him for 6. And it was the best part of 9 months before the police decided that there was nothing in that. And those were terrible 9 months. Then his mother died. He actually went through a personal kind of hell for the first 18 months of his time as leader of the opposition.
Now, that rape allegation, that surfaced in the press. It was widely talked about on the web, but it surfaced in the press, but he was never named.
That's right. He was named on the web in this new this strange new world of. So he was named everywhere on the web, and Pickering interviewed the woman who we refer to as Kathy, interviewed her. The press spoke of a Labor leader, and anybody, you could just Google and find out what was going on. But it was when the police decided that there were to be no charges laid, he then came forward and identified himself as the Labor leader.
Did he have to do that?
Oh yes, was by far the only sensible thing to do. The only sensible thing to do, and it's totally successful in terms of removing those allegations from the political discourse of the country. They are not there. Why
aren't they there?
I think because Australians are convinced that there's nothing there. They don't turn up, even in really hostile focus groups run by pollsters. People don't raise those allegations. The government has never used those allegations against him, and was very tactful all through the months where the Labor leader was never publicly identified. Those allegations are not part of the contest.
There are also allegations of an affair that, again, were sort of circulated on the internet and have never really been addressed publicly.
We seem to be addressing them now.
No. Why do you think that these sorts of things haven't surfaced? Is it smart media management, or is it that the press don't care about these things? They don't give them any merit?
Well, when the allegations about him having an affair with a member of his staff in Canberra surfaced, he and his wife were the subject of a double-page spread in the Herald Sun talking about the strength of their marriage and their love for one another. I call that surfacing. I call that really surfacing. That particular allegation, the particular rumour was that I forget the name of the staffer, but it was some name like Shannon, and that he'd got Shannon pregnant. Shannon was a bloke. So there was a certain shallowness to the rumour.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing is that, barring some remarkable exceptions from time to time, the private lives of politicians in this country remain pretty private by the wish of the public. A few years ago, a much-loved dunderhead in the Labor cabinet in Sydney was revealed by Channel 7 or somebody to have gone to a gay steam bath in Sydney.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah, yep.
And the reaction from the public to that was scathing, absolutely scathing. It was considered a brutal and unnecessary intrusion into the privacy of that man's life. And I think there remains in Australia a very valuable, decent understanding that we don't pry around in politicians' lives. Remember when the fact that Cheryl Kernode had I mean, having an affair with Biggles was I mean, that's a pretty political event, and I can understand really why that did become discussed and things. But the revelation of that was not greeted by general public applause. We are not America, and we're not Britain. In Britain, they'd be reporting any kind of shit like that they could find about anybody.
And pigs, involving pigs and prime ministers, for example.
Sophie, you don't need to raise that. But in Australia, we still do it a bit differently, and I'm terribly glad of that.
Staying on reputation, how damaging has the Royal Commission been for Bill Shorten?
You know, funnily enough, the truly damaging information that came out in the Royal Commission has barely touched him. The truly damaging revelation, and I applaud the Royal Commission for doing this, was to reveal that he had failed to declare a nearly $60,000 political donation to him. He just hadn't declared it. And his excuses were pathetic. His excuses for not declaring it were as pathetic as Dyson Hayden's excuses for remaining on as Royal Commissioner. And they were remarkably similar. I left it to others, I didn't notice and I forgot, and anyway, my integrity is unimpeachable. They used exactly the same formulae for excusing themselves. But of course, that's barely touched Shorten, because so many other politicians have failed to declare electoral donations that they're not willing to go him on that. So, the other material is the material that looks at the conflicts of interest that exist when he was negotiating deals for the men and women who are members of the union, while at the same time trying to earn a quid for the union itself from employers. And that's all beautifully laid out in the essay. For anybody who's been at all puzzled by the nevertheless splendid reports in The Age about this, and The Australian, but mainly The Age, it's all beautifully set out. Now, that is an unfinished story at the moment. He insists that nothing he did broke the law. And I've talked to some pretty senior barristers who work in that field of sort of union law, and they tell me that the evidence that he gave to the Royal Commission over those 2 days certainly doesn't add up to a breach of those laws, that there is said to be more evidence to come. But this is about conflicts of interest. It's a very, very rarefied area, actually. And the notion to read The Australian wailing about the fate of AWU members who might not be getting quite the terrific penalty rates they might otherwise have got is one of the most deeply comic things I've seen in a long career in journalism. This is a paper that has ceaselessly campaigned against penalty rates since the first ink went onto the first page 50 or 60 years ago. And here they are beating their breasts about the terrible things Bill Shorten had done to stop his men and women getting good penalty rates. I mean, it's pathetic. Mind you, at the same time, some of those deals are obviously completely uncongenial to the present leadership of the AWU, and they've been cancelled. So this is an unfinished area. And Shorten knows that this is not an area where people who don't read David Marr's quarterly essay will ever really be across the detail. And all they get is the smell.
Does the smell matter these days?
Oh!
Well, the smell of the unions. I mean, the fear of the unions.
I know, aren't they terrifying?
Yeah.
Yeah, nearly 18% of the workforce is now unionised. And disputations are on the lowest level ever, and wage rises are amongst the... But anyway, yes, it matters enormously because Abbott had 2 things to beat Shorten around the head with. One, that he had brought down 2 leaders in order to be where he is now. That's not actually a line of argument hugely available to Malcolm Turnbull. The second line of argument is that he is intimately associated with the grubby world of trade unionism. And that's going to be, that we're going to hear an awful lot about that, and that's why partly why the Royal Commission was set up. I mean, I think the Royal Commission has done some fabulous work, but that's, this is to entrap and admire Shorten in this area, hugely important. And hugely important for a wider conservative argument, which is one of the things I look at in the essay, that somehow or other former union officials are kind of disqualified from political office these days, that they're too old-fashioned, they're too grubby, they're irrelevant, and that kind of conservative argument is a very strong argument, and they're going to be depending on that a lot between now and whenever Malcolm calls election.
Speaking of Tony Abbott was a ruthlessly effective opposition leader. We all know that. Because as an opposition leader, you need to be a wrecker of sorts. In some ways, you need to, up to a point, but Abbott was very, very good at that element of it, ruthlessly effective. And you write that Shorten just doesn't have that in him. You say that Shorten struggles to subdue the agreement demon in his nature.
Jesus, that's a catty thing to say, isn't it? Yes, what I was talking about before. Dispute, settle, deal, settle. That's the pattern of his thinking. I admire Shorten for not being a leader of the opposition in the Abbott mould. Yes, it was effective, but this required sledgehammers to take over as Prime Minister, and then he found he had no tools in the kit box except sledgehammers. Slight exaggeration, but I have the highest hopes, and I think genuinely Shorten does too, that the arrival of Turnbull may allow a return, however contested and at times, I hope, dramatically contested, of political conversation returning again. And this is what the Australian public wants. I mean, the Australian public loathed all of that shit. Loathed it. Mind you, they voted according to it. But they loathed it. And Shorten is a talker. He's an arguer. He can be very persuasive. He showed what he can do with the disability insurance stuff. He can persuade the country to a point of view on that. But it changes the nature of the conversation.
But you also argue that he doesn't stand for anything brave.
Yeah. When you ask, well, what does Shorten, it's not true that Shorten stands for nothing. He stands for a very conservative, centrist bunch of Labor values. Honest administration, education, good finances, all of those, fairness, all of those Labor things. He's not the least a challenge to capitalism. He's worked with capitalism. He's from the time he was a young union official, he's talked about the need to have a prosperous society, that without a prosperous society you can't do anything for people. He understands all of that. He's fully signed up to a craven attitude to the US alliance. I mean, fully signed up to all of that. He's put his thumbprint or, signed in blood or whatever you have to do if you're going to be an Australian leader. He's done all of that. That's not a problem. But he's not built, I don't think, for weathering a truly ferocious contest in public on matters of high principle. So much of what disturbs Australia about Abbott, he never contested. He didn't contest the citizen stripping stuff. He didn't truly contest any of the security stuff. All of that is done. Big political achievement for him is to make sure that the Labor Party will sign up to the grossly uncivilised business of pushing off refugee boats. Big political achievement for him.
Is that a mark of his personal conservatism, or is it a strategy? He is a personally deeply conservative man. He's not religiously conservative. He's not sexually conservative in those kind of things. He's not signed up to the sex rules of the faith. In fact, Shorten gave the Australian Christian lobby a spectacular bollocking a couple of years ago. He just gave it to them about all of that sex stuff. Gave it to them. It was terrific in a way that Gillard never had the courage to do, and Rudd would never want to do because he kind of, in his soul, signed up to it all. But Shorten was fantastic. But, they signed up. Under Shorten, Labor voted for the Border Force Act, which means that doctors and nurses and social workers who tell us what's actually going on in Manus and Nauru can go to jail for 2 years. And when I say to him, how could you do that? He says, we're on the doctors and nurses' sides. No, we're absolutely all for the most... But I say, but you signed up, you backed the bill. No, I dispute your interpretation. It's rubbish. They went along with all of that rather than risk the wedge. And it's my hope that Turnbull is not going to do any more of that stuff. But if he does,
Shorten will go along with it. That's where the lack of bravery comes. I'm actually quite enjoying the sight of him standing up for the workers in the China free trade thing, because he's getting real heat for that. And do you know what? His public approval ratings are rising slightly. Now, Malcolm's are through the roof, of course, but Shorten's have actually risen in the last few weeks as he's taken them on with the China free trade thing. People like to see someone standing up, even if they don't particularly agree with what he's doing. They like the sight of it.
So ultimately, could Malcolm Turnbull be the making of Bill Shorten?
Look, we're all adoring Malcolm being there at the moment. It is sugar hit time, though. Christ, that what Xenophon said the other night. Did you see that? This isn't a sugar hit; it's a liver transplant. And unfortunately, Bill Shorten is the donor. That's a true zinger. But we're all adoring Malcolm at the moment. We are astonishingly pleased as a nation that Abbott has gone. In our lifetime, can any of us remember a Prime Minister going so unmourned? And as I wrote in The Guardian, he seems already to be a figure in the past. But Malcolm has a few things to deal with. Malcolm has to deal with the man he overthrew, who within 2 days was putting the boot in to Scott Morrison. Oh, I'm not going to be a wrecker, says Tony. And 2 days later, he's wrecking. Peter Credlin, bit of wrecking. There's wrecking going on everywhere. There are leaks. Now, this is going to be a huge challenge for Malcolm Turnbull. It's going to be a huge challenge for him to run a cabinet where, every now and again, people might disagree with him. Disagreement and Malcolm are not necessarily friends. We'll see how they go. There is no doubt whatever that Shorten's chances of being the next Prime Minister of this country were radically diminished last week, but I still say he's a contender.
A lot of criticism around Abbott has been the fact that he simply wanted to be Prime Minister. He just didn't have a plan for when that happened. Does Shorten have a plan for when if he becomes Prime Minister?
There's no developed program. You know, a few of us in this room old enough to remember Whitlam smashing his way to the lodge with a program. God, how exciting was that? And you can't have programs anymore, apparently, because of what happened to John Hewson. Remember, he had a program, and Keating destroyed him with the program, most of which, nearly everything in the program, of course, Keating personally agreed with. But that was beside the point. So we live in the political world in this country, which is terrified of long-term campaigning on big change and big ideas. Shorten, I'm not sure that Shorten is too upset by that. You know, he looked. Remember, this year was to be the year of ideas. The Labor Party promised us the year of ideas, but in fact, it was the year of Tony Abbott falling apart. And you can understand that you don't do the two things at once. But he is now. Shorten is now. He has to produce ideas. He has to produce policies. He says he's already been doing it, and it's true. They stopped Abbott's first budget, and that was a not inconsiderable political achievement. They stopped it, and there are policies out there, you know, positions on global warming and you know, on equal marriage. It's terrific. All of that is great, but he's got to come up with a great deal more that is actually, you know, he says to me in the last paragraph of the essay that he's got a plan for the future, and he's going to sell that plan for the future to Australia, not to News Limited, and not to Malcolm Turnbull, but to Australia. Well, Bill, give us your plan.
Thank you. Apologies for the Canadian accent. You mentioned that only 18% of the workforce is labour. You mentioned that Malcolm
I'm sorry,
Turnbull,
I didn't quite get that. 18%?
18% of the workforce is unionised. was the figure you quoted.
Something like
Yep.
that. 16, 18.
You mention that Malcolm Turnbull, or in your commentary, that Malcolm Turnbull is more progressive than Bill Shorten. The party that is more progressive than Labour right now is probably the Greens, living in Melbourne anyway. Who votes for Labour at the next election? Is Labour in danger of what's happening seemingly to Labour in the UK?
Well, let's go back 1 week, because that does matter. A week ago, despite all of the bizarre failures of the Rudd governments, it was a time of great achievement in my mind as well, but great failures. Despite all of that, for the last 18 months, Australia has been willing to welcome a Shorten-led Labor Party back to office with open arms. That's what those polls have been saying again and again and again. The Labor vote, the Labor primary vote, has risen strongly under Shorten, and the bounce of the polls of the last few days, while dramatic, really dramatic, has really only brought those parties neck and neck. So the execution of Abbott has brought the parties only really neck and neck. There are a lot of people voting for Labor. One of the curious things, though, is this. Labor has always been willing to neglect its progressives in the belief that, yes, they might go off and give their first vote to the Greens, but those votes will come back to them. Greens love Malcolm. And that vote may not come back to Labor while Malcolm Turnbull is leading the coalition. Greens, those former Labor voters might start voting 1 Green, 2 Liberal. And that is a tremendous danger to Labor, and I think it's great because it's going to compel Labor to take the progressives in its own ranks more seriously. That would be a real change, not take them for granted, take them seriously. Shorten doesn't much like the progressives in the party. He doesn't much like inner city branches. He's written so. I mean, after the defeat of Mark Latham, he wrote a famous essay which about Latham's what Latham did wrong, which was to pay too much attention to inner city branches to the left and to their causes. And Bill Shorten is blue-collar conservative Labor. That's what he is. But there's still a huge number of people willing to vote for that.
Okay, next
Maybe not
question.
a majority, but a huge number.
David, just interested to hear about what's your view on the contest between Albanese and Shorten, and whether Albanese is a contender for the leadership in the next coming months, given the change in Liberal leadership as well?
I call that contest the most civilised contest ever held in the history of the Labor Party. And it's unbelievably civilised. They were so nice to one another, more or less all the time. It was a contest in which Shorten performed much better than expected in the debates. Terrific one-liners from Anthony Albanese, but Shorten performed very well, very good speeches, very good debating. It was a classic tug of war between the votes of the rank and file and the votes of the caucus. As you know, there were equal value. So there was something like 34,000 members of the party voted, and I think 86 members of caucus voted, and so their votes had equal value. And Shorten got 84% of caucus, and Albanese got 82% of the rank and file. Shorten wins. And that's not been a bad contest for the Labor Party. The Labor Party is now more orderly, more disciplined, more behind its leader than anybody can remember in a generation. That's not just the Rudd rules for how you make and break leaders of the party these days, though that really helps, but it's also another of Shorten's talents that has go a bit unnoticed, which is that he's extremely good at healing broken institutions. He was very, very good with the AWU when he took it over in the early days. He's been very good with the Labor Party in in opposition. Remember, he leapt at a chance to lead the party immediately after its defeat, knowing that historically nobody who has ever taken that job has ever become Prime Minister. The Brendan Nelsons of this world, they never become Prime Minister. And he is hoping to beat history with that. He is, as far as I can see, very solidly entrenched as the leader of the party. And the mischievous remarks on Four Corners the other night of Barnaby Joyce saying, oh, now Labor is looking at Bill Shorten. I see no sign of that. Now, catastrophes can happen, but I see no sign of it at the moment. And I confidently spruik this essay on the basis that it is going to be current to whenever the elections are held.
You're a brave man.
I know, I'm taking a punt. No, but I'm pretty confident of that.
David, you mentioned the factions in Victoria as somehow they might be different from the way factions operate in other states. I also wonder, it seems from the polls that the Victorian electorate is very different from the rest of Australia, and I'm interested in your comments as to why that is and whether that is a difficulty for a Victorian leader to understand how the rest of Australia really is feeling about policy and stuff.
I think Victorian leaders do understand how the rest of Australia thinks and operates, but the rest of Australia has no idea how bizarre Victoria is. They really have no idea. And in New South Wales, the factions are incredibly powerful, but they're absolutely stable. So there are arrangements in place for the majority right to always share the spoils with the minority left. All those arrangements are in place. Factional war very, very rarely occurs. In Victoria, the factions are fragmenting, shifting, changing, aligning, realigning, falling out, regrouping the entire time. And whoever is on top takes everything. And that's why contest down here is so fluid and so vicious, because there's no sharing. Everybody, when you are in a position to do so, you take the lot. And that's pretty tough politics. What fascinates me is how so much talent can work its way through such a vicious system into the federal parliament, and how solid the support for Labor is in Victoria compared to the wavering support in so many other states where the factional play is so much more civilised. This, what I call the section of the essay brutal maths, because one of the people explaining, I had to go to university on the factions. My brain bled during the writing of this essay to master the factions, and I had a number of people helping me with it. And one of these guys said to me one day, David, it's just brutal maths. So that's why that section is called brutal maths. But out of this brutal system comes a highly educated, as I was saying, a highly politically educated political culture which delivers talent to Canberra, dunderheads to other places, but talent to Canberra and huge loyalty. And Victoria is one of the most Labor loyal states in Australia, and it's a bloodbath. Interesting.
The system works. Any more hands? Yeah, up the back there.
Yeah, g'day. My name's Adam. Great discussion. You're a great salesman, Dave, I must admit. Very charismatic.
The bookshop is just behind you, Adam.
We'll get to that.
Just a quick question. You were talking about new political discussion and Bill's sort of conservative centralist ideology, and you mentioned that he wasn't willing to risk the wedge. I assume you're talking about wedge politics, which,
yes,
from my knowledge and history, John Howard was probably the greatest at that. If parties aren't playing wedge politics, why not? Because it seems so effective when Howard was in power. Thanks.
Well, yes, Howard was the master of it, and one of the fundamental political lessons of Bill Shorten's life was the defeat of Kim Beazley in 2001 after the Tampa election. That was for him, because, you may not have been born at the time, but so that's a little bit rude. But in 2001, Howard put up a bill in the middle of the Tampa crisis, so appalling. It in fact allowed Commonwealth employees, Commonwealth officers to murder people out there. I mean, there was going to be a law-free zone out there in the oceans, and Beazley said he would not support it. And within the next 2 days, Labor support fell so strongly that it looked as that if Beazley had held his line, Labor would have been reduced to a tiny rump in the House of Representatives. Then Beazley did support the legislation, and there was uproar, but that support flowed back. Shorten actually commissioned an opinion poll within the AWU in 2001 to see what AWU members thought of the Tampa operation, and he discovered they overwhelmingly approved it. Overwhelmingly. And this is wedge politics. If it takes a leader of considerable panache and determination and bravery to risk the wedge, and Shorten has not risked it at any point in the 2 years that he's been leader of the opposition. And Abbott has pushed him and pushed him and pushed him, hoping that the point would be reached where he would break, where he would flinch, and therefore provoke, the Labor Party is indifferent to Australia's security, etc., or provoke outright warfare within the Labor Party. But Shorten has retreated in the face of all of that and held the party together at the same time. In its bleak way, that's a political achievement, but it's pretty bleak.
Okay, we've got time for one more question.
David, is there a possibility that Bill Shorten could bring the asylum seekers from Manus and Nauru back to Australia without being wedged, or...?
He has no intention of doing that. He has no idea how to clear those islands. I said, Bill, how are you going to do it? Regional resettlement, he said, which is, what everybody has been saying. But he has no idea how to do it, and no particular wish to do it.
Why not?
Well, because the fate of those 1,500 or 2,000 people doesn't weigh in the balance with him against the fear of the toxic politics of the boats sweeping Labor away again. But he's never been, boat friendly as far as refugees go. He's never been one of the Labor leaders who believes that any political capital should be ventured for the refugees who want to come here by the wholly traditional method of a boat. That's just not in his thinking. That whole area of politics in Australia is so locked and so toxic that that's where he is. And for him, it was a considerable political achievement to face down the remnant left in the Labor Party who still worry about those things at the National Conference and get the pushbacks policy into the party platform. Major achievement. Completely wonderful. That means we've got both sides of politics are absolutely agreeing on that. And he has no intention of clearing Manus and Nauru. None. It's very, very interesting that Turnbull started to talk about that this morning. And very interesting that Peter Dutton, who, you've got to admit, I mean, of that group of ministers that I immensely admired Kevin Andrews' hair and Peter Dutton's intelligence. And he was out there quick as lickety-split saying that the Prime Minister, just because the Prime Minister was talking about the concerns Australians have about the fate of those people on the island, did not mean that he intended to do anything about it. So, once again, Malcolm's got trouble. It's just, let's imagine that there is this, that we're moving towards this seamless, new, progressive, rational, intelligent politics in this country. He's got trouble. We're still waiting to hear what ICAC in New South Wales has to say about Arthur Sinodinos. And Mal Brough Malbrough's still there. Malbrough rewarded despite everything. And you've got people like Peter Dutton running immigration, and he kept him there. So it's going to be, I think, tremendously interesting few months. But God, Shorten's got to shape up. He's got to shape up in those months.
On that sobering note, we are out of time. And please join me in welcoming David for tonight's fascinating conversation.
Thank you.